Yeah, so I'm Zachary Calamore. I'm an adjunct fellow at CSIS, policy fellow at George Mason University, among various other titles. I do a lot of research around autonomous weapons, drone warfare, weapons of mass destruction. That's gotten decent coverage in New York Times, NPR, that type of place. Was recently on Netflix's new special, Unknown Killer Robots, about autonomous warfare, which was a lot of fun. And actually, I'll just let Gary and Philip, if you want to just quickly introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'll jump in. So I'm Philip Blake. I'm joining you from Monterey, California, due to the joys of this new technology we've all gotten familiar with in the pandemic context. I'm a professor in the Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, where I focus on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, and also some adjacent issues and responses to those threats. And I have enjoyed collaborating with both Zach and Gary on this project and a number of other projects in recent years. So we're excited to share this with you today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Ackerman. I'm an associate professor at the University at Albany and associate dean for research here in our college. My research areas are the intersection between adversary decision-making and emerging technology, but with a focus on CBRN as well. So I've had the pleasure of working with both Philip and Zach for a number of years.
Yeah, so today, as you can see in the title, we'll be talking about Plague of Locusts, preliminary assessment of multi-drone terrorism. So I want to start off by talking about Syria. So back in 2018 at the Russian airbase Hamimim in Syria, there was an unexpected attack with 18 drones of unknown origin that attacked 13 drones of unknown origin that carried out an attack. The perpetrators claimed that the attack destroyed a Russian S-400 air defense system. The Russians subsequently denied this, but and obviously in both cases, there's a pretty strong incentive to lie there, with terrorists wanting to upscale the amount of harm they had, and Russia wanting to deny what exactly happened. But the point was that this non-state actor, who we're a little unclear who exactly it was able to launch and carry out attack using 13 different drones, all on their own, all working together. And that represents potentially a significant change, sort of how we think about terrorism, how we think about drone terrorism writ large, and what that looks like going forward, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Go to the next slide. So the bottom line that we're going to be talking about today is that multi-drone terrorism is both qualitatively and quantitatively more significant than regular drone terrorism. This is for a few reasons. Like, okay, so you get these sort of obvious, 13 drones is 13 times more potential damage and potential harm than a single drone, the obvious one there. But I think the quantity actually has very much a quality of its own when it comes to these types of attacks, because the ability to use multiple drones also creates the potential to overwhelm a lot of the defenses that folks sort of have at play. What we've seen is that many of these bespoke counter-drone solutions that are out on the market today, a lot of these are sort of like handheld jammers and stuff like that. They're not designed to even potentially track, much less engage large numbers of drones all at once. So it potentially overwhelms some of these defenses. And even if potentially the attackers or defenders are successful in knocking out all the drones, there can still be some pretty significant psychological effects of simply worrying about like the large numbers of drones, of being sort of persistently being like ready to be attacked at any potential time. Folks in, for example, Armenia and Azerbaijan, soldiers there were talking about how like drones there were a constant permissive threat for them, when they had to constantly worry about sort of drones coming out of the sky. Now, in that particular case, they were looking at more state actor, but you can imagine how that could happen in the exact same way with terrorist groups. In fact, that was a significant challenge for the United States Special Operations Forces in the Middle East, in which they were constantly being bombarded by these attacks. And even if they were shooting them down, like most of the time, there's that still sort of that constant vigilance and constantly being ready. So the numbers can have a pretty significant effect all on their own. In the near term, typically what we're talking about is typically 1 to 10 drones, like that potentially up to that 13 there. The obvious exception there is when we're talking about state-sponsored actors, your Hamas or Hezbollah, that type of thing, where they're going to have necessarily much greater resources that they can bring to bear, where they can not only have multiple drones, but large numbers of them and potentially integrated and using various autonomous and artificial intelligence in various ways. And that's potentially even a relatively near-term threat. Over the long term, I think that we do need to worry seriously about sort of tens to even hundreds of drones. Again, like that high end is probably more the state actor type threat. A random lone wolf who's just kind of working on his own. Probably not going to be fielding and launching 100 different drones at once, but you can imagine how that will scale over time. But what's more is that you also see greater amounts of collaboration and autonomy as these drones sort of work together using artificial intelligence, programming to enhance and evolve some of their particular behaviors. Next slide. Yeah, so just give you a quick sense of where we're going to be going here. So I'm going to be starting by just like having some common language, make sure we understand what we're talking about here. I'm going to give a quick history of drone terrorism. Then I'm going to turn it over to Gary to talk about the incentives, both for and against using some of these systems. Then Philip's going to be talking about the acquisition, like how hard is it to do some of this. Then I'll come back to talk a little bit about some specific scenarios, and then bring it back over to Philip to talk about policy implications. And I'll come back at the end to sort of wrap up and add any additional color as needed. Next slide. So drones as a technology is often used to refer to unmanned aerial vehicles but it could potentially incorporate every domain of operation. We've seen in the Ukraine, for example, unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned undersea vehicles. But typically when we're talking about multi-drone terrorism, really more of the focus is unmanned aerial vehicles. We have seen terrorists use on occasion unmanned surface vehicles. So the Houthi rebels has carried out attacks in Saudi Arabia on various frigates that they had using some unmanned surface vehicles there. But that's more of the exception rather than certainly the rule. And when we're talking about multi-drone terrorism using large scales of it, and at least in the near term, I think we can expect the focus primarily to be on aerial vehicles there. I also make a strong distinction between drone swarms and drones en masse. Drone swarms, what I mean by that is drones that are integrated and communicating together to accomplish shared objectives, essentially turning that 13 different separate vehicles into a collaborative single entity that they can all work together, as opposed to drones en masse, which is like just a bunch of drones that are just working by themselves and not necessarily have that communication. And that matters for at least 3 reasons. So first of all, when you have that communication collaboration, you have potential to scale to much higher levels, because you have that ability to collaborate and manage the behaviors of that system. You don't necessarily need to be managing the particular waypoint trajectories and the particular movements of each of those different drones. So you can potentially have much more. The second significance is that it also creates a couple potential vulnerabilities there, because if you have that communication, then you can also sever that communication. So that's a potential way that defenders can manipulate it. And necessarily, if you have swarming algorithms and the various programming systems that manage that, that's also greater degrees of cyber capability that may be manipulated or attacked in various other ways. And then the third significance is that necessarily that swarming implies a higher degree of capability in order to field that, because you need the swarming algorithms, you need the ability to modify the drones themselves to have that communication collaboration. So it's going to be necessarily harder to do that. So this distinction ends up being fairly important, and you should see this crop up in a few places as we go forward. Now, the degree of autonomy is variable here, but it must increase at scale. By autonomy here, all I really mean is just the ability of the drone to take actions without humans guiding it. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything all that sophisticated. The analogy I like to use, you can imagine that we have a small little quadcopter sitting on the table here, and I have a big red button that when I press it, it comes 6 inches in the sky, hovers for a second, and then comes down. Technically speaking, that's a fully autonomous system. Once I hit go, it does every single thing it was designed to do on its own without human intervention. I'm not controlling it, not doing anything else. That said, all it's doing is coming up, hovering for a little bit, going back down. It's not necessarily all that meaningful, all that significant. So when you're talking about swarming and what that autonomous means, it doesn't necessarily mean all that much. It may very well just be, say, waypoint navigation, where you move from point A to point B to point C following GPS routes. But as you bring up the size of that swarm, it necessarily must be more autonomous. Because if we start talking about, tens, hundreds, thousands of drones, there's no way a human can individually control each of those particular decisions and what that's actually doing it. So there must necessarily be higher degrees of autonomy. But it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's sort of a lethal autonomous weapon system. It doesn't mean that the drone is making, intelligent targeting decisions of like, okay, that's a bad guy, go blow it up, or, something like that. There may be some level of human control on those particular decisions. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those are advanced. Like maybe it can recognize like, okay, that's a person, but not anything more sophisticated than that. Like it's not making, complex strategic calculations or anything like that. So there's a lot of variability here in what that means for drone swarms. Next slide. To give a quick overview of drone terrorism. So drone terrorism is relatively new, all things considered, especially compared to sort of the history of drones in general. So, we first saw commercial RC airplanes around since 1938, like, decades ago, almost a century coming up. Not yet, but close enough, getting close there. But we didn't actually see terrorists begin to use it really until Amish and Riccio in the early 1990s, where they experimented narrowly with using drones for delivering chemical and biological weapons. They ultimately concluded that it, wasn't their best approach, and they carried out attacks inside of the Tokyo subway rather than using drones themselves. But it was, one of the first instance, or the first instance where we see that sort of interest. And I think it's noteworthy that, that's what, 50, almost 60 years since this technology has been around. Like there's a pretty big lagger here in terms of like that, the technology going to actual adoption. We've seen in recent years the interest in both multiple drones and just terrorist drones in general just skyrocket due to the increasing availability of this technology, where you can go down to Walmart and buy a simple DJI drone for about $1,000, not terribly significant. And terrorists have increasingly recognized that potential. So, for example, during the Battle of Mosul, the Islamic State flew something like 300 sorties in the course of a month using drones, and they used it quite significantly. There's been a few other notable instances just in the recent Hamas attack on October 7th. They employed 35 drones. These were not swarms, these were just individual drones. They were using them to carry out a wide variety of attacks, hitting communication towers, as well as some Israeli remote controlled weapon systems and other types of targets, as well as I think they actually destroyed a handful of tanks using just like these simple, cheap, off-the-shelf drones. In 2018, there was an attempted assassination of the Venezuelan president. There were 2 drones that attempted to take him out. Both of those got shot down. Given the numbers, it's a little suspicious to me why they wouldn't, if they had 2, why not get 5 or 10 or more than that? But I don't particularly know what was going on there. But either way, it illustrates that there are this sort of interest in drones writ large, including potentially large numbers. The challenge that you run into is sort of the cognitive limits of, the more drones that you have, the harder it is to control. If you're like a Hamas or a large, like a state-sponsored organization with large amounts of people, that's not necessarily that big of a deal because you can have enough, pilots and other folks who can actually do all that and manage it. If you're just sort of a lone wolf on your own, that's going to be a little bit harder. You're going to need much more advanced systems, much more autonomous systems to be able to use that multi-drone capability. And drones in general can support a pretty broad range of attacks, of activities, pretty much the full scope of military operations, everything from surveillance to propaganda to carrying out attacks. We've seen that, for example, in the Christchurch attacks that was in 2020, I think. Gary might remember this. When was Christchurch? Sorry, calling you. Looks like you don't got to mute. No worries, you're good.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many and exactly what year.
Oh, no worries. But yeah, just a handful of years ago, the attacker actually used a drone to scope out and monitor the mosque, I believe it was, before the attack, basically flying the drone around, collecting information about, pattern of life type activities that were going on there to, plan for the actual attack. And you can imagine how multi-drone capabilities would be useful for that as well, from, looking at multiple range of different areas at once, looking at from multiple perspectives around a particular target of interest. And you can imagine how that's scaling fairly significantly, or perhaps using different types of sensors from infrared to electro-optical and other to get different types of information prior to your attack. We've also seen drones being used significantly for propaganda. The Islamic State would regularly use drones to film their attacks. Even if the drone was not carrying out the attack, they would drive up a car bomb, blow it up, and then film it and then spread that on YouTube, social media, wherever, and just show off hey, look at all the damage that we've done and how awesome we are, and that type of thing. And you could also imagine how multiple drones would be useful for that as well, not only capturing different angles of the attack, but also being sort of a propaganda in and of itself, hey, look, we can field these 100 drones or whatever, look how powerful and capable we are, we have this fantastic Air Force. And that alone is, perhaps the sort of obvious one here is that it has that potential for carrying out attacks. Typically terrorists haven't had all that much access to the air, barring, the fairly obvious big exception of September 11th. But for the most part, terrorists don't have significant air forces or aerial capabilities, but having drones or multiple drones allow them to change that. But the calculus is complex, and there are both reasons to pursue that and there's reasons not to. And I'll let Gary jump in now to talk about that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Zach. I'm now going to talk a little bit about why terrorists might or might not want to use drone swarms or other forms of multi-drone terrorism. The first thing to kind of understand in all of this is that when you talk about motivation, there's no particular single factor. The terrorist groups, whether they do this consciously or unconsciously, they actually weigh a number of different factors. Potential incentives and advantages with potential costs. They weigh those against each other. They also weight those advantages and potential costs according to their own preferences. For instance, some terrorist groups might be more willing to take risks than others, or some might have more funding available to implement things than others. So they weigh all of this together in their own context, and then they not necessarily in a formal mathematical way, but they come to some conclusion about the relative advantage of this new kind of modality, because multi-drone terrorism will be an innovation for almost all terrorist groups. So they have to compare it. Once they have a relative advantage, they have to compare what they think the net advantages are and compare that to what they're currently doing and what other things they could do. So they compare multi-drone terrorism, for instance, against such things as standard car bombs or armed assaults, or even single drone terrorism to traditional drone terrorism, or they compare it against more exotic things like pursuing a nuclear weapon. So only if, when they compare these across all their possibilities, and they decide that the greatest benefit will be from all of this on pursuing multi-drone terrorism, will actually multi-drone terrorism actually manifest. However, this can occur. Sometimes terrorist groups don't only pursue one thing at a time. So this might be part of a portfolio of things that they're pursuing. But it is some kind of calculation. So if we want to understand this, we have to sort of unpack a little bit about what the advantages and disadvantages are, with the understanding that these cannot be viewed on their own. It's a combination of these in the particular circumstances of a particular terrorist group in a particular time in a particular place. So as long as you understand that, we can start looking at some of the general advantages. One of the first things to think about in this regard and to mention is that drones in general represent possibly the only plausible access, at least at the moment, for most terrorist groups to have some kind of air power. Remember, they are fighting against what they view it, and usually almost always stronger opponents, at least in terms of militarily stronger opponents, and they try and match those opponents to some degree. And in many terrorist groups think of themselves as kind of military fighters or fighting a war of some kind, even though it's an asymmetric war. They, at the same time, they can kind of conduct ground operations. Some terrorist groups can conduct, as we saw with Hamas, the recent attacks, can at least try and conduct waterborne or maritime operations. But drones is really what they can do in terms of their access to air power. Single drones, for example, give terrorists the option of standoff attacks that can circumvent defenses and attack an enemy in its rear, or sort of the soft underbelly of an enemy. They can also be used for intelligence gathering. They can also attack precision targets at a distance. These are all advantages of single drones, but it's very limited. Single drones are limited in what payload they can take. They can't carry very much. They're also limited, although you can claim to have an air force if you have a couple of drones. If you're attacking with one drone at a time, that's not a very intimidating air force, generally speaking. And they're also susceptible to countermeasures. There's many products on the market, from nets to trained hawks that are trained to counter, a drone or small number of drones. So having more drones, there's actually potential advantages to having more drones. However, if you want more drones and you want to use them at once, there's an important consideration to take into account. And the first is how much autonomy do those drones possess? Because if the drones are just standard drones, which we refer to as dumb drones, where each drone needs a single operator, it only scales linearly. So if you want twice as many drones, you're going to need twice as many operators, pilots. If you want 5 times as many drones, you need 5 times as many pilots. So yes, they'll do 5 times as much damage, but you need 5 times the amount of resources, not only in the hardware and software of the drones, but also in the pilots and logistical resources to conduct those attacks. However, once you start introducing autonomy and you're getting to true drone swarms, where Zach has mentioned and alluded to, these begin to scale non-linearly, because the software itself and the drone swarm algorithms and various other autonomous aspects like GPS guidance and various other factors, because these take over a lot of the control aspects of the drones, it is conceivable for far fewer operators to be needed to operate a large number of drones. So conceivably, if you have a true drone swarm, you could have one or even no operators in some circumstances control, several up to hundreds of drones. This is all feasible. So it becomes then a true force multiplier in that sense. So then you have nonlinear scaling. So when we think about some of the ideas of drones, when you have nonlinear scaling, this really lengthens the level of asymmetry. And terrorism, after all, is an asymmetric activity. Fewer operatives want to cause more damage against opponents that almost always have far more resources than them. So in this sense, this can make it very attractive, this particular aspect of drones. But we're going to sort of go through these advantages one by one. And the first one is mass casualty potential. Really, a single drone, if you have maybe a chemical biological weapon, you can cause a fair amount of damage, and you can maybe cause mass casualties under optimal conditions. But still, your payload is limited, and it has to be delivered exactly, at the right place at the right time to really have maximum effect. However, if you can multiply this by 10 times or even 100 times, you now start getting a true mass casualty capability, even if you don't have chemical, biological, or radiological agent, even if you have conventional explosives. If you start adding together even if each drone can only carry 1 kilogram, and there are many commercial drones off the shelf that can do that, and more expensive drones can carry well over 10 kilograms. If you now start having 20 or 30 or 40 of these drones, each carrying, let's just say 5 kilograms of high explosive, you're starting to rival very large vehicle-based explosives. You're also can increase the impact of this, because a single drone might only have in terms of instilling fear and causing disruption, might only have a limited amount of disruption they can cause. But if you say, if your targets, maybe a civilian population, see 30 or 40 or 100 drones on the horizon, that has a far more intimidating effect. We'll get back to that in a little while, but that can also cause more psychological damage, can cause more fear, can cause more things like stampede reactions where people are crushed trying to flee, those kinds of things. You could also, create spoofing attacks where drones drop things like water or flour that people believe are CBRN agents, and therefore panic and result in further injury to themselves. So the drones themselves, especially a drone swarm, can provide terrorists theoretically, at least with mass casualty potential, that a single drone could not. The other area about, especially if you're looking at this nonlinear scaling of required capabilities, if you have fewer operators operating more drones, this lowers the operational risk for the terrorist group. They, instead of having 30 operators operating 30 drones, if those operators are interdicted, you've now lost 30 people. If you have 30 suicide bombers, you necessarily lose 30 people from your terrorist group. Some terrorist groups can't afford to lose that. However, if you have 1 or 2 people, managing 50 drones, even if those are interdicted, whether during the attack or shortly before the attack, you've only lost 1 or 2 of your key human resources. So it lowers the operational risk to the group itself, but also the fact that you only have 1 or 2 operators, only need 1 or 2 operators, makes it easier for them to conceal themselves at a distance, to operate the drones without being detected. So now you have increasing the likelihood of success of an operation purely by having fewer operators. So it can lower overall the operational risk. Another important element is when you're talking about autonomous drones and drone swarms, you can often simulate this in a computer before you do it. So you could actually simulate your attack in a computer, test it, find where there's problems, correct those problems, and therefore this might give you an advantage that you don't get if you have to actually just operate those drones. The only way to test them is in the field. So the nice thing about some of the drone swarming technology from a terrorist point of view is that it might allow you to test this before you actually engage in an attack. So that's how it can lower the operational risk for all these reasons. It can also enable precision. So an element of this, all drones are useful to terrorists because they can be programmed or they can be flown to a precise target, and they can therefore exploit vulnerabilities that other weapons could not. So the example here is a vent or a window in the top floor of a building. A drone could go inside that and then attack somewhere inside the building that wouldn't be accessible through other weapons. Suicide terrorism is similar to this, but drones, it's even more likely to get precision. However, if you have multiple drones, you don't lose this precision, because especially if you have a drone swarm or other elements of autonomy, and there's many videos like this you can find on YouTube, you can see them, they come to an obstacle, let's just say a window, and there's 50 drones, and they organize themselves to one by one go through the window and then assemble again in a swarm on the other side, in a mass swarm. So you don't lose your precision element even as you increase your mass element of your attack. Now, interesting thing, this could actually lead to a new form of terrorism called mass discriminate terrorism. Because in the past, we either had discriminate terrorism, which was like assassination, very, very targeted, or you've had mass terrorism, which is very indiscriminate. It's been very difficult, if not impossible, to have mass discriminate terrorism. But because a drone swarm would allow you to have both, or multi-drone terrorism would allow you to have both precision and mass at the same time, you could think of things like a swarm entering a building and only targeting specific executives in that building. Flying to each drone with an explosive flies to a particular office, particular executive, and therefore you can wipe out all the executives who you don't like in that without attacking anybody else. So you can have mass discriminate terrorism. Now, this is theoretical. Nobody's ever succeeded in this, and we hope that it won't happen. But at least multi-drone terrorism allows you this possibility theoretically of mass discriminate terrorism for the first time. So another example would be drones using machine vision to recognize and target specific types of vehicle, like a police car or an ambulance. Those drones would be discriminate in that they only attack particular targets, but they can do this at mass, which some terrorist groups would actually seek to do, especially if they are more reticent to harm what they view as innocent parties. The next step is lack of countermeasures, and we've alluded to this. Many of the countermeasures that exist currently for drones might be overwhelmed by a large number of drones. So, elements that shoot down drones or trap drones in some way, they might be able to deal with 1 or 2 or 3 drones. Can they deal with 1 or 2 or 300 drones? At the same time, signal jamming, which is a major way of a method of countering drones, this could be, at least to some extent, negated by autonomy. Because if your drones are completely autonomous, communicating with each other on a predetermined flight path, or at least with predetermined objectives that have been programmed in, there's no real signal from an operator to the drone swarm that can be disrupted. Yes, you can disrupt the signals between the drones, but a lot of the signal jamming technology is designed to disrupt the signal between the drone and the operator. And if you don't need an operator, or if the operator has only a minimal role to play in the attack, then this countermeasure becomes a lot less effective. Now, hopefully, the people who design countermeasures, the technology folks, will evolve new countermeasures to counter this. But at the moment, this is something that might be attractive to terrorists. And the last part, and this I've sort of already alluded to as well, is publicity. Any terrorist group that could exploit large-scale drone technology, especially in a drone swarm, which by necessity represents a technological innovation, a quite serious technological innovation, this would no doubt garner a lot more publicity and attention than any other attack, even an attack with the equivalent amount of firepower that killed an equivalent amount of people or injured the equivalent amount of people. The very fact that the drones are operating, terrorists have been operating a high technology, sophisticated attack, or an attack which displays that they can target individuals, and no one can be safe. This would draw global headlines like very few other terrorist attacks, except for a large weapons of mass destruction type attack. So this might be attractive. Drones might be attractive to many terrorist groups, multi-drone or drone swarms, specifically because they would get a large amount of publicity and attention to their cause and to themselves and to the attack. Okay, so there are substantial advantages, as we just said, but there are also disadvantages, and I'm going to quickly run through some of those. Obviously, a large amount of capabilities are required. Now, in the sort of dumb multi-drones, where you need a single operator for every drone, you're going to have a lot of resources. You're going to have the drones themselves, the weapons that those drones, or the payloads, or the cameras that those drones are using. And then you're also going to have a trained operator that needs to control each drone. So the capabilities therefore scale linearly, the required capabilities up. Now, the capabilities required, and Philip's going to go into this in a little bit more detail about what those capabilities are, but if you have, even if you have a autonomous drone swarm, you don't necessarily have quite as many capabilities needed, but you need a lot more high-level technological capabilities. And I said I'll leave those for Philip to detail. But this can provide a disincentive for groups that can't have this. The other element is a learning curve. No terrorist has ever conducted a large-scale autonomous drone swarm attack, for instance. They have, as Zach mentioned, they have engaged in multi-drone attacks, but the higher-end drone swarm attacks have never really been used. So the terrorists would have a very steep learning curve on how to operationally use and successfully deploy and train with and prepare for a very large drone attack, like a 300 or 400 drone attack. So this can also be daunting with terrorists who don't want to spend the time and resources and deal with the uncertainty of a steep learning curve. And the last one is linked to that, which is the risks of failure. Whenever you innovate, there is a risk of failure. If you're doing something, well, if you're doing anything, there's a risk of failure if you're a terrorist, but there's larger degree of uncertainty and risk of failure when you attempt something new. And there's a lot of uncertainties. With basic multi-drone attacks, these uncertainties are less because you're basically just scaling up linearly your existing drone capabilities if you have that as a terrorist group. But when it comes to drone swarms, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty whether you can coordinate them, whether they'll work. And so a lot of terrorist groups, because terrorists have limited resources, limited times, they're usually under some kind of pressure from security forces. Many terrorist groups do not want to take these large risks. So this could also be a disincentive. But this, of course, depends on the nature of the particular terrorist group and how risk tolerant or risk averse they are, but also depends on what their situation is. If they have a safe haven in a country that supports them with lots of resources, they will then probably be more likely to take some of these, take some more risks and chances. Okay, so given all of these advantages and disadvantages and the fact that they will combine in unique ways in each circumstance, they're highly contingent on circumstance, there are still certain terrorist groups that are more and less, others that are less likely to adopt multi-drone attacks. And we've already seen groups that are state-sponsored will more likely have the support and the resources they need to either acquire multiple drones and multiple drone operators, or to acquire the high-level technological knowledge and skills that they need to conduct a drone swarm attack, to actually operate a drone swarm. So state-sponsored groups are most likely, and many of the most proficient state-sponsored groups of today, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, et cetera, are state-sponsored organizations. So state-sponsored jihadist groups, you put those together, those are probably the greatest threat for a high-end multi-drone attack, or even just a multi-drone attack. Also, other jihadist groups that have substantial resources, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they have actually employed drones. They found them very useful, and especially because they have safe havens in various areas. Thank goodness ISIS does not have quite the safe havens in Iraq and Syria that it did before, but it still has pockets around the world. Affiliates of ISIS still have pockets where they have reasonably safe havens. Those also make it a lot more likely that a group would adopt this. On the other side of the fence, lone wolves with limited technical capability are unlikely, unless they are lucky enough to have an inherent technological capability themselves. But the average lone wolf or lone actor terrorist with limited technical capability and limited resources is far less likely, well, they're completely less likely to being able to engage in standard multi-drone terrorism because they just don't have the operators. But even in terms of the autonomous functioning drone swarms, they're far less likely to have the resources and the capabilities, skills, et cetera, to carry these out. So this should give an idea of sort of where we're most likely to see these drone swarm attacks first. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Philip, who's going to talk about how the acquisition process might occur.
Great. So thanks, Gary, and thanks also, Zach, for starting us off. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to unpack in a little bit greater depth than we already have what acquisition might look like. Then I'll hand it back over to Zach, and he'll outline for you what might be the most memorable part of the presentation, some scenarios, imaginative scenarios of what we might see emerging in future in terms of this threat. And then Zach will kick it back to me to touch on the policy implications as we wrap up. And then we want to make sure to leave a couple minutes at the end for Q&A. So I just want to circle back to the question, or remind ourselves of what we're talking about when we keep using this word drone, because we're encompassing an awful lot of different technology. So mostly what we're talking about, as Zach mentioned in the beginning, is aerial systems. And that's usually how we use the word drone. But we encompass in this work terrestrial and both surface, water, and underwater systems. And that's mostly the domain of states. At this point, it already is the domain of states, and it will increasingly be the domain of states in future. And it may be in future, and in some limited respects, it already is the domain of non-state actors, and in particular, ground-based or terrestrial vehicles are something that we've seen in a limited way. And when I say aerial vehicles, we're mostly talking about things that are quadcopters, or maybe they have octocopters, right? Maybe they have more propellers, but not only. So for example, what you see here is a picture of a kind of a drone, though I don't know exactly actually what this one is, that we saw ISIS use, the Islamic State, where there were these improvised fixed wing aircraft that were used. So we're not just talking about quadcopters, but at least for now, we're probably mostly talking about them. And then there's this really crucial distinction that Zach emphasized between drones en masse, just large numbers of drones operated in parallel, and drone swarms that are swarms because the individual entities coordinate their actions with each other in the shared pursuit of a goal. So what do we mean? And I'll mostly talk about drones in the way that unmanned aerial systems and copters in the way that we're mostly talking about them, but it's useful, I think, to think about the other categories. So we're thinking about some kind of a platform. It's an airframe with a propulsion system, if we're talking about something that flies, or whatever the analogy is, on the ground or in the water. We're presumably talking about some kind of payload. Maybe that's a camera if you're doing surveillance. Maybe that's a bomb if this is some kind of a substitute for artillery, right? Something that you fly to a target and detonate it, but some sort of a payload. We're talking about flight control systems, which consist both of sensors and of software that integrates the inputs from the sensors to allow the aircraft, or if it's not an aircraft, the device to be mobile. We're talking about some form of communication between the pilot and the system, although when we're talking about swarms, as we've mentioned earlier, it might be the case that that information was programmed into the system before it was launched, for example, and then the system had a considerable degree of autonomy. And then we're talking about a whole logistics chain associated with producing, storing, testing, transporting, and otherwise supporting drone operations. I think it's fairly intuitive that on this spectrum, the part of this technology that's the most challenging, or likely to be the most challenging, is the part that supports swarming. So the ability of multiple drones to coordinate their actions with each other in the pursuit of a shared objective. The reason I caveat that a little bit is that might not be so challenging if it's available in a black box form as a commercial off-the-shelf technology, which it already is in limited respects, and it increasingly will be looking forward. And so that's the most challenging if you're developing it yourself, but that's also something that quite plausibly might be available to you from as a terrorist actor from other sources. So there are four kind of broad pathways that we could imagine actors procuring this kind of technology. So multi-drone systems, whether that's drones en masse or true swarming drones as we think of them. One is a native development, but really that captures a couple different things. So one thing that falls into this category is COTS, or commercial off-the-shelf technology, right? There's lots of drones that can already be purchased, and there are some versions of drone swarms that are being commercialized that are available. For example, you may be familiar with drones that are used in lieu of fireworks, right? So we have these remarkable drone shows where dozens or hundreds or even thousands of drones are coordinating their actions to put on light shows. And that's an example, by the way, of a swarm. So when you're kind of picturing, like, what do we mean when we say swarm? That's an example. So one option for a threat actor is to simply acquire commercial off-the-shelf technology. And there obviously are a range of systems that are available, and that actor would be limited both by their resources, the funds they had available, but also some of these systems are more or less controlled. Some of these systems would ping, warning lights, or hopefully would ping warning lights among authorities if an actor was procuring them, or a suspicious actor was procuring them. So commercial off-the-shelf technology, modified commercial off-the-shelf technology, right? So there are opportunities to take things that you can buy where you don't have to build a whole novel system for yourself, but you modify, for example, by adding a payload that wasn't the design payload. So you take a drone that was designed to carry a camera, which can be heavy, and you mount an explosive on it instead. So you might modify commercial off-the-shelf technology, and then you might do in-house development. And the Islamic State is a particularly interesting example here, where it had remarkable, it had a weapons development complex that there's been some interesting public reporting about. The New York Times, among others, has done some interesting journalism on that to kind of flesh out how that worked. And drone technology was part of that, though so were many other systems, like, for example, improvised explosive devices and other kinds of weapons. So there's this kind of category of native development, but that encompasses, I think, a couple different things. There's the category of state sponsorship, and both Zach and Gary have mentioned that if a non-state actor has state sponsorship, it's quite intuitive that that dramatically enhances the capabilities that they bring to bear. And I think there are a couple things that are worth observing here. One is multiple states are developing drone swarm capabilities in a military context. And obviously, private non-state actors are also developing drone swarm capabilities of various kinds. We also have examples of states supplying drone capabilities. In particular, Iran has helped several of the organizations that it supports, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebels, and has provided them with drone capabilities. So we already have examples of states providing these kinds of capabilities to non-state threat actors. So one of the things that we're not talking about today, but which I want to briefly flag for you because it might be interesting in the Q&A, that we did in the article that we're presenting to you today, is we did a kind of literature review where we asked the question, are there other literatures that give us insight on how to think about the potential threat of drone terrorism? For example, literatures around non-state use of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, on which there's a rich literature, but other literatures as well, like the literature on state air power, for example. And so one thing that we thought in this context is it might be the case that where state actors have to date been very hesitant to provide, for example, CBRN capabilities, chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear capabilities to non-state actors, thankfully, and hopefully that persists, they might be less reluctant to provide drone capabilities because the norms against drones, including large numbers of drones, are far weaker. They might fear less blowback for providing this kind of support versus, for example, aiding an actor with chemical weapons in a way that they might fear would risk blowback against the state sponsor. And then the other thing to flag here that sort of loosely belongs under the state sponsorship category is it doesn't have to be intended state sponsorship by the state. It might be that state actors share technology for ideological reasons, for financial reasons, or otherwise, though those are probably the two primary ones, share state technology in some way with non-state actors. One could imagine theft as being a pathway that non-state actors could access some of this technology. And that might be theft of non-government systems, it might be government non-military systems, or it might be military systems, though presumably the challenges of either stealing or, as I'll talk about in the next category, taking control of remotely military systems are considerably higher, but one can at least conceive of that. There are a lot of challenges associated with that, in particular, more sophisticated systems, and in particular, systems that are deployed in a military context are going to be, we think, really challenging to try to steal. And then there's this possibility that an actor might remotely take control via cyber intrusions of systems. And again, that might be non-governmental commercial systems. I mean, imagine a bunch of drones over an outdoor music festival that are just caused to crash into the music festival and cause people to panic and stampede, right? So they actually might just be, systems might be present in a location and might be hijacked or even just jammed in a way that cause some consequences. They might be government systems. For example, law enforcement is increasingly using drones, for example, to surveil large public events and provide public safety, and one might compromise those. Or they might be military with, again, the obvious caveat that military systems are likely to be more robustly defended against cyber intrusions, and so harder to compromise. And this isn't just the scenario of taking full control of drones, right? So one possibility is that you jam communications, maybe in a way that causes the drones not to do the function, the surveillance function that they're doing, and then that facilitates your attack in other ways. Maybe you cause them to crash into a target. A simple way that you might do that is just to spoof the drones into flying into the wrong target, right? You just tell the drones to fly to the wrong place. And if you tell them to fly into a crowd, that could have considerable effects. There's a lot of nuances here. And in many respects, this is probably a target of opportunity kind of scenario where the drones are already present, maybe in a combat theater, maybe protecting a public event, or in some other context, and an actor maybe is able to take advantage of that, though it's worth flagging that there are considerable challenges to doing this. So part of what we're trying to do here is just to conceptualize for ourselves and for you what the sort of full range of this threat space looks like. And we felt like this was an important one to include, even as there are considerable challenges for actors. Now I'm going to kick it back to Zach. And I think this will probably be the most memorable part of the presentation, because he has some stories around ways in which one might conceive of this threat evolving, and then he'll kick it back to me to wrap up and talk about some policy implications.
Yeah. Get the next slide there, Gary. Yeah, so we wanted to take it sort of out of the sort of abstracts, like, okay, here's kind of how terrorists think, to try to think more concretely about, okay, what could these types of attacks look like? So obviously these are meant to more just get it in the real world, not necessarily that these are the most likely or that they're not necessarily the most risky, but just some concrete ways to think about the spectrum of the threat. So the first one we have is sort of stop the concert. The idea here is basically you have a whole bunch of drones that release bombs over a crowded area, over mass gathering. That could be, say, a stadium, that could be an outdoor concert, something like that. Where in those spaces you have very high density populations, where even if your drones aren't necessarily all that accurate at hitting, each individual, because they're not being necessarily have the controls there. Even some simple errors and sort of just dropping it in the region can hit a whole bunch and cause a significant amount of harm. Not only do you have the actual direct deaths from the bomb itself, but potentially you have sort of, as Gary alluded to earlier, sort of a rampage or sort of like stampeding type activity where folks will like kind of freak out and they just all run for the doors and kind of, squish over each other as they're going. And although we highlighted bombs here, you could easily imagine doing the same thing with, say, flour or something like that, where folks don't necessarily know that this is actually anything not harmful, but they assume this is, anthrax or something like that that's going to be really harmful, and they kind of freak out anyway without actually doing any direct damage. The second you can imagine, and this is one that I find particularly concerning, is sort of chemical release. T.X. Hamus, he's a distinguished fellow at the National Defense University. He likes to talk a lot about sort of drones as bringing the detonator, where, given that many of these drones have relatively small payloads, yes, you can buy a drone for like $1,000 on Amazon, but it's going to have like less than a kilogram of weight to it, which is really not that much of explosive. So the idea of bringing the detonator is you hit something else that then creates the actual harm itself. So the idea here is you say, carry out an attack against a chemical facility, hit some particular vat that causes a rapid release that then causes significantly more harm. The particularly scary incident of this would be a Bhopal style release, which was, 1984, where in India at a Union Carbide chemical facility, there were some breakdowns in safety and basically caused a mass release of chemicals, causing somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3,700 or so people to die, and some like 16,000, I think, or so. No, it's higher than that. It was like, I think, on the order of like tens of thousands, but significant amounts of harm. Now, of course, in that particular case, it was not because of drones. It was, safety failures, and also happened to be fairly close to a number of like, slum type areas where there was high densities of populations. But nonetheless, you can imagine, an attack on, say, a chemical facility near New York City, or perhaps inside of New York City, where it would cause significant harm from that rapid release. And I think that scenario now is especially concerning because Congress recently allowed the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards to lapse, which was the legislation that allowed the Department of Homeland Security to establish various security measures at chemical facilities around the country and enforce them. So unfortunately, at the moment, the Department of Homeland Security does not have that authorization. That said, those standards didn't include all that much about drones, but nonetheless, it's still, I think, potentially very serious vulnerability. Scenario 3, you can imagine sort of one of the particular other scary scenarios I find is with agricultural drones. These are drones meant for like spraying pesticides, that type of thing, for farms in the field. These are much more expensive. They tend to run like, $10,000, $20,000. But they're basically ready-made chemical weapons delivery systems. These are designed for carrying and spraying pesticides. So instead of pesticides, you have some sort of chemical agent, or perhaps you even have like fentanyl or something like that would be tremendously harmful. So the idea here is you get a few of those agricultural drones and you go over a similarly crowded place and just spray a whole bunch of these chemicals all over. There was some modeling done by the Massachusetts Fire Department that looked looked at what would happen if you sprayed fentanyl in like a crowded stadium using a bunch of drones. And their estimate was I can't remember how many drones that they had. It was a handful. But they were estimating like 10,000 casualties or something just from spraying like the fentanyl all over the place, both from like direct harm from the agent, as well as sort of that stampeding behavior. But as I said, I can't remember exactly how many drones they had, but I believe it was a fair number on that. But so certainly you can imagine that being quite significant. The other potential scenario is you take advantage of that sort of mass there, where you take attacks against world leaders, where in those particular cases, you don't need all that many of the drones to succeed. You launch 20 drones against the president of the United States. If 19 of those get shot down and one of them actually makes it through, that's potentially changing the country, if not the entire world. So that's potentially very, very significant when it comes to like having, and a big issue there is sort of whether those countermeasures are available and ready to protect in those particular cases. So again, as I said, I don't necessarily think any of these are more or less concerning or likely, but I think it gives a good example of sort of the range of activity that we could potentially expect to see with this. And back to you, Philip.
Great, thanks, Zach. So I'll just take a couple quick minutes to summarize here, kick it very briefly back to Zach, and then we'll hopefully have just a couple minutes left at the end for Q&A. Apologies, this, as it often does, went a little bit longer than we had intended. We thought we would have this luxurious period for Q&A. So one thing I just want to emphasize is we're talking about an emerging threat. And so there's some very limited ways in which this threat has already emerged. So we've mentioned a number, Zach in particular has mentioned a number of attacks that have already happened, but mostly we think this is something that is emerging and we're trying to get ahead of it in terms of our analysis. Think about ways in which it might emerge, right? What kind of a threat might this end up being? And therefore, how should we prepare for it? So how should we prepare for it? I think some of this is pretty obvious. One is obviously we need to monitor the evolution of the technology, right? To be thoughtful about the kind of technology, a lot of which is emerging not on the military side, but on the civilian side, to allow ski patrollers to more safely release avalanches, to allow, as Zach mentioned, farmers to more efficiently disseminate pesticides and fertilizer around their fields, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to monitor the emergence of the technology and the potential threat implications of it. We need to monitor threat actors, in particular threat actors who are exploring this domain, but also just threat actors who might be interested and who have plausible capability in this space. We need to pay attention to the attacks that happen, that are in this space. So the multi-drone attacks that will happen will be very informative in terms of how this threat is evolving, in part because there is a potential demonstration effect. Other actors will be watching, and if these attacks are regarded as successful, we should expect more. And so we need to watch, and all of these are pretty straightforward. We need to think about security of particular high-risk targets. And there are a lot of high-risk targets. Two really obvious examples are airports, which are very soft in many respects. Now, they have security perimeters, and airports are grappling with the implications of this technology and struggling with the implications of this technology. That we've already had episodes where, hobbyists flying drones near airports have shut down traffic at airports. So that's one of many soft targets. And then Zach mentioned another one that's really important, which is the security of VIPs, including government leaders or corporate leaders or other people who might be targeted. And so thinking about what are some of the more high value targets, if you can't protect all of the targets, and how we protect against this potential threat is really important. We need to invest in research and development on how we're going to counter these and think about how some of our capabilities scale, right? A system that has capability, as Zach mentioned, against one or a few drones won't necessarily scale to larger numbers. And so we need to start to think about that, and that may require some very different capabilities. It's worth noting that some of our defensive capabilities do scale nicely. For example, if you blast microwaves to knock drones or impair drones, you could impair a very large number of drones, and there are side effects to that because you might impair other friendly electronic systems. But so there's a lot of caveats to unpack there. We need to think about providing counter-drone technology, including multi-drone counter-drone technology, to allies and partners, right? Some state actors, including the United States, are more sophisticated, but others are less so. One of the ways in which the United States has supported Pakistan, for example, is to help it in various ways to protect its leadership. And that those technological measures that we have shared with Pakistan have actually saved the lives of Pakistani leaders in non-drone contexts. And this is something that we need to think about in the drone context as well for people for whom the defensive technology will be less accessible, because we have a shared interest, presumably, in, for example, Pakistani leaders not being assassinated. We need to monitor and investigate and especially establish regulation around this domain of, in particular, unmanned aerial systems, but as it evolves, it won't just be aerial systems. And one thing we thought was an interesting analogy here was UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which is targeted at chem, bio, rad, nuke threats, and in particular non-state actors, and which tries to, for example, bolster global norms and global capability to respond to this threat, the notion being that the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And we think that's an interesting analogy for thinking about international efforts to grapple with this threat. And then we need to think about responder applications. And one thing to flag here is multi-drone technology has potential applications in response to multi-drones. So that's one way in which the good guys or we might leverage this technology, but it has a lot of other potential as well, including in natural disaster response and lots of civilian contingencies. And that's what's driving the evolution of this technology. But it has a dark side, which is that it might be leveraged by threat actors. Let me stop there. I'm going to kick it back to Zach. I think he's going to summarize in a minute or two, and then I guess we'll have a minute or two of Q&A if time remains.
Yeah, thank you. Given the time, I'll just keep it relatively short. I'll just close up by saying, when we think about like drone swarms and massive amounts of drones, it's easy to think quickly about, okay, this is science fiction and dismiss the threat a little bit. This technology is here now, and terrorists are increasingly using these to carry out attacks. And as folks become much more familiar with this technology and recognize the potential that it has, I think we can expect to see more and more of this. So states across the world, I think, very much need to be ready to prepare those defenses, think through where this is headed, and make sure that the folks in their countries are safe from this emerging threat. Thank you. And I suppose with that, I suppose we can take some Q&A questions if there are in the last couple minutes. Yeah.
Seems like a huge difference between terrorism and applications is publicity. And with multi-drone, the option of having those and filming and streaming it live to the internet would be a fourth multiplier. That's the capability, the communication. The people using cannot hear you.
Oh.
The connection between publicity and being able to use multi-drones to actually film live what you're doing, connected to streaming on the internet and having a much bigger impact than just death and destruction.
Yeah, so there's been a couple papers have looked at drones and publicity writ large. The Islamic State certainly has been doing this quite a lot with, collecting video using those types of drones. I'm not aware of any that have specifically looked at like multi-drones specifically, as opposed to sort of drones in general. To be honest, I'm inclined to think that like the publicity value for multi-drone systems specifically is more the publicity of like showing off that they have this technology rather than the actual like recording of it. Because it strikes me as like, you have like 6 or 7 drones or whatever filming your car bombing attack. Like, okay, you could get a little bit more benefit there and like, you can shoot it from different angles, make it more of a movie production, something like that. But unless you're like a really high end actor where, having 6 different operators like with 6 different drones, it doesn't strike me as like the level of like value that you would get that relative to the capability needed wouldn't necessarily be there. Gary or Philip, do you have anything else to add on that?
I think you covered it well.
As an example, 9/11 was publicized not by the bad actors, but by our own news media as it played out. So that everybody in America got to watch that. And that was far more chilling. I mean, the death, of course, is chilling itself. But that's an example of the publicity that could be done intentionally.
Well, that's an interesting point. I suppose you could sort of also have like live camera feeds like next to and like see like what's happening as it's going. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that particular angle, but yeah, that is an interesting one. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I was wondering, as a terrorist weapon, what is the range of those? Like, have some kind of a swarm activity. How easy is it to detect it in a urban environment? How is the range of a system like that? Will be the range.
So it depends a lot on the particular type of drone.
Right.
Like even within terrorist drones, there's a pretty broad range of capability. Everything from like DJI quadcopters that you and I can buy. Those I believe typically have closer. I think they get up to like 8 or 9 kilometers. I think ish, something like that, but not terribly significant. Part of the challenge you run into with those is the beyond visual line of sight. That is, if it gets too far away, you can't necessarily see where it's going to operate and control. But that said, there are also drones on the commercial market that are not technically swarming, but could be swarming, that have very significant ranges. The one that jumps to mind is I think it's the Mugen 5. It's a Chinese-made drone that a number of smuggling companies have used or not companies, but like organized criminals have used. Ukraine has also used that particular system to carry out deep strikes in Russia, hitting Russian naval activity. Those have a range of somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, 300 to 400 kilometers, I think. So quite significant. But as I said, those aren't swarming, but in theory, one could make them. That particular system is available for, I think, like $30,000-$40,000 ish online.
So they can carry enough fuel to go these 300 or 400 kilometers, and also give a payload of explosives or whatever.
Yep.
Because I do own a DJI drone, which is, let's say a few kilometers range, but it's a very minuscule. It's mainly for photographing.
Yeah.
But okay. So they can be quite significant. They can be far away from the impact point, so it cannot be detected easily.
Yeah, quite significant. But you're going to have trade-offs there between like the costs of that, because like yes, you do have those really long range ones, but they're also significantly more expensive. For like a state-sponsored terrorist organization, that's definitely that's very feasible. $20,000-$30,000, whatever. But there's still going to be, even there, you're going to have trade-offs. How best do we spend this $20,000-$30,000? But it does provide essentially a small indigenous, like effectively a cruise missile type capability without too much cost.
So also just to sort of jump in on that, it's I mean, sometimes having a longer range is actually very useful, as Zach pointed out, gives you the equivalent of kind of a cruise missile, but it's not always useful because terrorists operate in a very clandestine way. They don't have to, drones, each particular drone is quite small and compact. So, they can smuggle in over time multiple drones into a city, into a warehouse or something else, and then launch the attack from there, even if it's, less than a kilometer from the target area. So, they don't always need to have long ranges. There are many kind of conceivable attacks that could be created without long ranges, especially because, altogether 100 drones, it takes has quite a big profile. But the individual drones can be smuggled in over time into areas. So in an urban environment, especially, which is where most terrorists attack most of the time, in urban environments, there's a lot of scope for launching attacks, even with limited range drones.
Sorry to interrupt, but we ran out of time. Thank you for this interesting presentation. If you want to wrap up.
Thank you. Yeah. No, we appreciate that you have a timeline to stay on. So thank you for the opportunity to engage you, and thanks, Zach, for being in the room for us.
Thank you, everyone.